The roguelike genre of gaming has always been rather synonymous with requiring a high amount of skill to play. But what if a roguelike required not hard-earned effort, but monotonous grind and pay-to-win microtransactions to succeed instead? There are roguelikes exploring different avenues of gameplay, like Dead Cells' Metroidvania fusion, card game strategy in Slay the Spire, or an isometric perspective with a heavy focus on story like Hades. But what about a free-to-play, subscription-based live service roguelike with PvP elements? As it so happens, both of the latter ideas I just mentioned get checked off by a game known as Let It Die. This survival, dungeon crawler, roguelike-esque game offers something unlike anything I've seen. After beating the game with a final playtime of 46 hours, I believe I have enough credibility to go in depth about every mechanic this game has to offer, and I can safely say that a valiant attempt at monetizing a roguelike formula does not work and will probably never work, because it goes against every design philosophy in the genre. In this video, I'm going to explore the infuriating experience I had with Let It Die, and how this frankly, aesthetically creative game is outweighed by janky combat, a grind-infested progression system, and a blatant pay-to-win economy. This is my horrific journey through Let It Die.
The goal of the game is pretty simple. Just make it to the top on the Tower of Barbs. It's like a hack-and-slash roguelike kind of a thing.
Let It Die is developed by Grasshopper Manufacture, which is a Japanese game studio that also produced well-known titles like Killer 7, No More Heroes, and Lollipop Chainsaw. While I personally never played any of these games, I can certainly tell how its cel-shaded art style bled its way into Let It Die. This game first released in 2016 as a PS4 exclusive. If it hasn't been made clear, Let It Die is a free-to-play game with a freemium model of monetization. Though judging from its extremely subpar player count, it's no wonder they decided to release it on PC as well. Even now, there's only a dedicated fanbase of around 100 concurrent players, with its all-time peak sitting at a sub 2,000. To put into perspective how few people play this game today, even Dead Cells, an indie roguelike that released around the same time, still has around 2,000 concurrent players on average. When I get into the details of this game, you'll probably understand why the analytics are so abysmal. But before I go any further, I just want to remind everyone that 100% of the viewers that watch this video are subscribed to me. Thank you very much, you are too kind. The story is simple. After an apocalypse has consumed the world, a mysterious tower has appeared in metropolitan Tokyo. This is the Tower of Barbs. Legend has it that great treasure lies at the top, but no soul has made it that far. Will you be the one to reach the summit? You are joined by Uncle Death, a skeleton with sunglasses. He's pretty cool. With his help and your mishmash of team members, you set off by creating a class and character, and off you go to climb the tower. We start out in a dingy sewer area. The control and gameplay are simple. You have nothing but your fists. Salvage weapons and armor from your enemies, gather food and mushrooms to heal and buff yourself, and collect resources to make them into newer, better weapons once you return to the hub area. But not so fast. Every item will take up an inventory slot, and your inventory is very limited, so you better pick and choose what you want to take with you. You can hold up to 3 weapons in each of your hands. Toggle through them with the D-pad. Both your weapons and armor have durability, so you always gotta carry fresh ones to replace the old. You can throw or eat any consumables. You probably want to eat food and throw any grenades, but you can also throw food and eat the bombs, which will just damage you. I mean, what did you expect? There is also a dodge roll mechanic, which you could use to dodge enemy attacks. There's also stamina, which is signified with a beating heart within your character. It beats faster and faster as you perform attacks or rolls. So now your first impression might be, oh, so it's kinda like Dark Souls combat but in a roguelike and resource management setting? Wrong. This game could not be more different than Dark Souls. But don't worry, I'll leave the complaining until later. The main game contains 40 floors on the Tower of Barbs, and select floors connect to a central elevator. They essentially serve as checkpoints and can be used to return to the hub area to cash in your progress. This is where the roguelike element comes in. The map layout is actually universal. All the floors you've explored so far will still be there even if you die or return. But if you don't make it to a nearby elevator, you'll have to go back up again. Each floor is randomly generated, so each visit to the tower will be slightly different. I should mention that the layout is more or less the same, but the major structures of each floor have their locations switched around, and the map of each floor is wiped clean upon each visit, so you still have to go through the level all over again every time. If you die at any point, you'll be given the option to revive yourself to full health with a premium token that costs real money, or return to the main hub. You can buy back the character with a fee of kill coins, which is the in-game currency, or go back to the floor you died on and kill your old character who has turned into an enemy to reclaim them, or just remove them from your roster entirely. More on this later. There's a healthy amount of weapons and armor, each with their own flair. You got machetes, hammers, clothing irons, revolvers, sniper rifles, katanas, and much more. Using a certain weapon type levels up your mastery level with that type, and will gain bonuses as you level up, like unlocking another attack move, more hits in its combo, or reducing the amount of stamina it requires to use. Your mastery levels actually carry over universally, so if you become really good with swords, every fighter you pick up in the future will also be very good with swords. Speaking of which, stamina is consumed whenever you sprint, attack, or roll. It replenishes quickly, but if you use too much, your character will stop to catch their breath, leaving you very vulnerable to attacks. So always manage it well. Attacking also fills up your rage meter. When you get enough, hold the action key and execute a powerful move with either weapon in your hands. If you stun an enemy, you can also execute them with a flashy finisher. These always look pretty epic. Whenever you're at the main hub, you'll first get to cash in your XP and upgrade your stats. Then bring any blueprints for new items you found in the tower to the shop. You'll be able to add that item to the shop permanently after fetching the required materials to craft it, and you can buy an infinite amount of that item with gold, albeit with a timer of how frequently you can purchase it. You can also upgrade an item by bringing in even more resources. Beside the shop is the decal dealer. Decals are passive abilities that can be applied to your fighter. The more powerful your fighter, the more decals you can stick onto them. Buying one will cost you a pretty penny though. You can hold different fighters at a time in your freezer. You can try out the other classes if you ever get bored of one, or unlock higher grade fighters when you reach certain floors. The all-rounder has balanced stats, the striker prioritizes strength and health, so it's good for melee setups. The defender and attacker are more of a PvP thing. The shooter is good at using ranged weapons. The collector has additional inventory slots. The skill master is completely useless. No, I will not elaborate on that. And the lucky star can find more gold and is more likely to land critical hits. You can use the classes to your advantage, like using the collector class to gather out resources from floors you've already been to, then switching to an offensive class when pushing higher floors. The gameplay loop goes something like this. Equip yourself with decent gear, ride the elevator to the highest checkpoint you reached, and try to find a route to reach a higher point that contains the next elevator. The higher the floor, the better the loot, but also the deadlier the enemies. Certain floors contain a mini-boss, which in reality there's only 4 of. They just keep putting a tougher version of each within the 40 floors you climb with inflated stats. Gather better quality resources, better loot, more blueprints, and return to the hub when you think you need to refill on supplies or just want to store your hard-earned loot so you don't lose it if you die. Sounds pretty neat, right? It's a unique take on the roguelike genre. At least this was my first impression of the game as well, as my progress past the first 10 floors went rather smoothly. Of course, this is as far as I'm going to glorify this game. Let's start talking about the combat. The problem in gameplay starts rearing its head when you realize the combat in Let It Die is extremely clunky. In a game where you can hold an item in either hand, it should have been a playground for experimentation for creative playstyles. How about a fire-based weapon in your left hand, and a weapon that deals additional damage to enemies on fire And you're right, except the majority of weapons in the game have little to no synergy with one another. You finish attacking with one weapon, then your fighter has to wait until the attack animation is done before attacking once more. It feels like there's no flow in your attacks, and no room to experiment with different weapons. Since your weapons eventually break, I found the best strategy to dish out the most DPS is to just fill your slots with whatever strongest weapon you got, and just use that one weapon over and over again. In most 3D combat games, you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to mobility. Say you want to change direction or cancel out of an attack. You should be able to do that to make sure the player feels like they are in control. In Let It Die, this is not the case. When you attack, you cannot cancel out of the attack or move around until you finish the animation, which leaves you very susceptible to interruptions. Let's talk about the roll mechanic next. Remember when I said the dodge roll is used to, well, dodge enemy attacks? Yeah, except despite what you think, the roll doesn't actually give you iframes. In Soulslike combat, you find the perfect balance of sneaking in your own hits while skillfully dodge rolling through enemy attacks. Yet in this game, if you try to dodge through an enemy's chainsaw attack for instance, your character just awkwardly gets stun locked in place mid-roll while you stand there helplessly, take damage until the attack is finished. That's right, if you're hit by an enemy, you're stun locked. This can have catastrophic consequences when you get comboed by a group of enemies. A bad hit can cause enemies to permanently stun lock your character and just instantly kill you with one chain of attacks, and there's nothing you can do about it.
No. Oh, get out of there, get out of there, get out of there, get out of there.
On every floor, there is a unique enemy known as a hater. Something this channel does not have. Haters are enemies that were once a real player that died on that floor, and now you have to defeat them with the gear they had on them when they died. Sometimes haters have such differing power levels from the enemies on that floor that they can completely catch you off guard. I'll also briefly mention the wonky enemy AI. Say you get into a fight you can't finish, you're running low on health, or your weapon just broke. Naturally, your first response is to run away from enemies and get your bearings. You would expect that enemies would lose track of you eventually, except the enemy AI in this game is programmed to chase you down to the ends of the earth. It does not matter how far you run, they will try and hunt you down. The pathfinding and detection is also pretty out of whack. If you suddenly hear the combat music kick in, brace yourself, because it means that sometime, somewhere, an enemy will eventually, miraculously, pathfind its way to you. When fighting, the best strategy, as it turns out, is to not dodge, but simply run. By sprinting back and forth and baiting out an enemy attack, they're the ones that get locked into their attack animation. Then you just run up to their side and get in your own attacks. This is how you can safely dispatch every single enemy in the game, even bosses. This single strategy of baiting out attacks works so well, you can beat any enemy this way even when underleveled. It goes without saying, this playstyle gets repetitive fast, since you really want to avoid taking damage and potentially getting stun locked. The reason to do this is that the game discourages players to get creative, as dying has extremely dire consequences. So next, I'll cover how dying works in this game, and it'll serve as the entryway to how Let It Die monetizes itself. When you die, you have the option to revive on the spot by expending a death medal. These are premium tokens that you mainly get from spending real money. A single death medal roughly estimates to around 50 cents. But since they seem to be running special deals all the time, I'll be generous and say that each death medal is only 10 cents a piece. Now you might be thinking, isn't this just blatant pay to win? Can't you just pay your way to victory no matter how many times you die? Well, here is where I'm gonna defend it a little bit. If you're getting one-shotted in a boss or a level, no amount of revives is really gonna do you any good. It's best to just throw in the towel and level up your gear, then come back later. You should really save this as a last resort if you're like one hit away from winning the fight. Though the time I played, there was an event where I got one free continue per day, so that's pretty cool. Your death medals should mainly be spent on upgrading your storage space, as it is a much better value. But let's say you actually died. What then? Well, first, let me take a detour and talk about the Express Pass, which is the game's subscription-based monetization system. For the low price of $15 a month, you have access to a plethora of advantages to make your climb a lot easier. Let's take a look at what they are. As I mentioned before, when you die, you can bring your fighter back to life by paying coins. You pay more the higher floor your fighter died on. The fee gets to an insane level if you die on floor 30 and up, as the gold needed to bring them back will require hours to accumulate by grinding. But wait, if you have the Express Pass, you get a discount for the buyback. How much? How about 80% off? Did the buyback originally cost 250k gold? Well, now you can bring them back for just 50k. That gold that you saved can be used to stock up on resources and upgrades, which is a huge weight off your shoulders. But say I didn't want to pay. I did say that you can retrieve your fighter's body by defeating them on the same floor. Well, doing so is way less advantageous. Why? Well, by buying back your fighter with coins, you get to keep all of their stats and gear. Anything they had on them before they died just comes right back, and you get to play as them without losing any progress. Retrieving them by defeating them, on the other hand, will cause all progress they made during their last climb to be lost. Their entire inventory, gear, weapons, food, blueprints, gold, XP, even their decals, all wiped from existence. If you spend an hour trying to climb to the next elevator, found all sorts of goodies, and gained enough XP to level up 10 times, you just lost that entire hour worth of progress. This is something roguelike games want to avoid at all costs, making the player feel they just spent hours playing the game and got nothing out of it. Hades allows players to expand the lore and get upgrades upon each death, so even if you lose, you have something to look forward to. Dead Cells allows you to keep a portion of your gold and cells when dying, so you can still make some progress towards unlockables. Slay the Spire and Binding of Isaac both give you unlocks for certain milestones, so your next runs will still feel fresh. Let It Die, on the other hand, holds your progress hostage until you pay up with gold or buy the Express Pass. This is extremely scummy, as buying back your fighters with gold is the only way to ensure your progress. And given the game's clunky gameplay, dying rarely feels like it's the fault of the player. So what are some of the Express Pass's other advantages? Normally, riding an elevator will cost you a small fee, and every time you go to one, you'll have to be reminded by the gold-plated, velvet-cushioned express elevator beside it, and how you have to pay a subscription to ride it. See that really cool-looking feature? Yeah, you can use it. The express elevator does not require a fee, so you can use it as much as you please. If you use the normal one, the fee is not that high, but it can add up over time. Plus, you'll have to ride the elevator twice every time you enter and leave the tower. With the Express Pass, you also get a random premium decal every day. These are powerful passive abilities that you can stick onto your fighters. But remember, if you don't retrieve your dead fighters using gold, you will also lose any decals they had on them. Unlike gear from the shop, decals are one-time use. One decal can be applied at a time, and any additional ones will have to be bought again. As for the PvP aspect, other players can raid your base and take your gold and splithium, which is another upgrade currency. However, with the Express Pass, anything that gets stolen from you gets reversed, so you'll never have to worry about losing currency. Last but not least, and possibly the worst offender of a pay-to-win mechanic, is the permanent extra 10 inventory slots for every fighter. Your inventory in Let It Die is precious real estate. By default, you only have 20. That means anything you find while climbing will have to be considered whether or not it's important enough to take with you. Since all your gear, weapons, blueprints, consumables need a slot each, you'll run out of space really fast. Now, the developers have gone and said that players don't need to pay to enjoy the game, and that the paid content are only conveniences that the player has the free choice to pay for. I disagree with this sentiment. No player will choose to be inconvenienced. If I was the developer and I said to the player, hey, would you like 30 inventory slots? Or would you like 40? Why on earth would you ever choose 30 when 40 slots is just a direct upgrade? Why would anyone want to purposefully inconvenience themselves with a smaller bag? How is it player choice if you're taking away all the options and leaving them with one? If you buy the Express Pass, you will, beyond a shadow of doubt, gain many gameplay advantages over non-payers. It's a classic case of create the problem, sell the solution. Now, a popular argument to defend that Let It Die is not pay to win is that you can simply just play more. Sure, you get less space to carry, get rated of your resources, get less powerful decals, pay more for fighter buybacks, but you can just make up everything with your time. You just have to play more, but you can achieve everything as a free-to-play. So this is where the line gets a little blurred. I define the phrase pay to win as being able to reach the win condition of whatever game you're playing faster if you pay real money. In this case, reaching floor 40 of the tower or anything beyond that. Sure, you can't directly buy upgrades or gear that can give you an advantage. However, everything I just listed, all the advantages that the Express Pass brings, will allow you to carry more resources with you every run, pick up more materials to bring back, and be more lenient with your moment-to-moment gameplay, ultimately allowing you to indirectly reach the win condition faster. A great video by Josh Drive Hayes outlined the properties of a pay-to-win system and how it blurs the line to make it less apparent.
You're still giving yourself the ability to access the win state faster. Instead of directly buying the sword, you're directly buying an advantage to go and get the sword. There's an extra step involved, but ultimately spending money still means you are getting to the win condition faster.
All in all, my argument is that the game is pay to win. But here's where I'm gonna defend it a little bit. It's not that bad, as even paying can't circumvent the amount of grind you have to do. I have no problems with game companies trying to make back the cost of creating a free-to-play game. If the game sold skins, I would have no complaints. I do have a problem if they gatekeep basic quality of life improvements and straight-up upgrades behind a paywall. This game was designed with a free-to-play scheme, microtransaction-based model from the ground up. Every bit of game mechanic reflects this. The gameplay is clunky, and the upgrade system is stingy, and it is precisely so to make you frustrated and nudge you to eventually say, "Here's my money, now give me progress." The devs did not state a clear reason why they made the game free-to-play, but I have a really sounding theory why they did so.
Money.
A lot of obscure MMOs or live service games manage to stay afloat because a small percentage of whales will keep throwing money at them because finding even one whale is extremely profitable. Now, everything I just mentioned, the stingy inventory space, the clunky controls, the samey combat, a question you might ask is there an actual way to beat the game without paying or causing a hemorrhage? Yes, there actually is. A phrase I hear again and again in the community when I looked up guides is the idea of a gear check. It's best explained if I just explain my journey up the Tower of Barbs. Just like any freemium game, it starts out rather innocently enough. You scrounge up whatever you can find and climb to floor 10 at a good pace. Given the low amount of unique structures, I often found myself seeing the exact same room layouts over and over again. This structure on floor 3 appeared again on floor 4, and I was confused if I was still on the same floor. This game clearly values quantity over quality. Anyways, I make it to floor 10 with my mishmash of scavenged weapons and armor and face the first major challenge. Every 10 floors occupies a boss known as a Don, one of the guardians that prevent you from advancing further. Remember what I said about a gear check? Yeah, I realized this idea a little too late. At the time, 4 hours into the game, I haven't been punished too much. I was able to make do with whatever the game gave me. So I enter the level, and our opponent is Max Sharp. We go through a level on a train track. By landing on platforms, jumping across tracks, we slowly make our way to the front of the train. And I'll admit, this level design is pretty creative, better than the previous levels at least. If only all the floors were like this. So as I reach the front, we are dropped into a boss arena. This boss may seem unique at first, but Max is actually just a reskin of a mini-boss I already fought, who just has some new moves up his sleeve. This fight was my rude awakening of what's to come, and what used to be scratches off my health from normal enemies, Max would shave off a good third of it every hit, sometimes comboing me into the electric fence. At this point, I still thought I could dodge roll the boss's attacks Dark Souls style, except this was when I realized the roll does not give iframes. This will be the second time I say it, but this game is not a Souls-like. After expending a death metal since I was so close, I was able to best Max. I'm congratulated by my crew, and floors 11 to 20 are unlocked. A quick look at the achievements. Let's see how many players beat floor 10. And it's 12%. Only 12% of players who have the game in their library ever made it this far. Well then, continuing onwards. Now instead of a sewer area, floors 11 to 20 features the theme of an abandoned city, which is a nice change from the claustrophobic underground. This is the stage of the game where some degree of grind will be required to progress up the floors. Specifically, there are multiple floors that will contain mini-bosses. The higher the floor, the more tankier they will become. My first barrier was the Jin Dai boss on floor 16, where an underleveled fighter can get one-shotted by this unfair laser beam attack. So immediately I got to work. I searched up what weapons are good, what gears are good, and what's the best strategy. The community seemed to agree that the clothing iron is the best weapon to level to clear the main game with. So I farmed up the materials to level up the iron as much as the game lets me at this point, and got on to the boss. Remember, I'm doing this to prevent dying, because the punishment is just too high. This game doesn't seem to like it if you play it blind and rewards you for following a guide to its last step. This is the best way you can find success on your climb. There is a lot of jank in the game, but you can learn to play around it, which is exactly what I did. So I make it to the floor 16 boss. Let's see how well I do. Now that's what I call skill. This is also the point of the game where you unlock a new tier of fighters, whom of which have higher level caps and stats than the tier below, so it's highly recommended to get new fighters when it becomes available. So far, the grind has begun to set in, but it hasn't been that bad, so let's continue. The Don on floor 20 is Colonel Jackson. We start the boss fight by disarming 3 bombs with a time limit. Enemies are fairly manageable. Then the main fight starts, except the boss is really just a slightly buffed version of Jindai, the exact boss I just fought 4 floors ago. Again, the level design is fine, and the fight itself was pretty enjoyable. So let's see how many players made it this far. 6.8%. Wow. So we're halfway there. Floors 21 to 30 have the theme of an amusement park, which has some pretty good looking set pieces. The layouts look fresh and new after traversing through a sewer and the city. But of course, since there's only a handful of structures for the levels to choose to generate from, if you've seen floor 21, you've seen the next 9 floors too. At the same time, floor 20 plus is the moment in my journey where the grind really started to set in. To put it simply, the grind in Let It Die is downright abysmal, worse than any game I've ever seen. When the word grind comes to mind in gaming, it's usually the monotonous activities that often get optimized. So you spend as little time doing the boring stuff so you can actually get to the good stuff faster. Of course, it helps tremendously if players know how much time they need to put in order to reach a certain result. So you know where the endpoint will be and have more confidence in tackling that goal. Let It Die, however, does not do that. Upgrades for your gear will require certain materials, but the drop rates for them are not guaranteed. Say I wanted Wire Mountain for one of my upgrades. Well, I'll need to go to a floor that contains it to collect it. I can either go to a floor that spawns materials in the same tier as the Wire Mountain, but not this material specifically, or I can go to a floor that spawns Iron type materials, except the Wire Mountain is a 2-star material and irons of other qualities can also spawn. This means it's completely possible to spend time farming for a certain material only for RNG to screw you over and return empty-handed. If you thought this was bad, you haven't seen the worst of it. Most upgrades later on also require a certain material that can be obtained from killing mini-bosses. You can also get them dropped from elite enemies and certain areas, but the drops are random. The only way to guarantee a specific boss material is to actually go and farm that boss. Except, they are also not guaranteed to drop it. Let's say I wanted the DoD Black Metal. Well, the wiki says it drops from the Cohen mini-boss on floor 26, except the floor that contains the boss isn't connected to the main elevator, so I have to clear and find the entryway to that floor first. Remember, the map and the floors are randomized each time, so I have to slog through the same enemies, the same level structures, using the same run and bait strategy to reach the boss. I defeat it and just think that I could have spent the last 15 minutes waiting for this moment so I can inch ever closer to my next weapon upgrade. And there was a chance that the boss just dropped a random weapon or some gold instead. Now I have to spend another 10 minutes or so making my way back to the elevator. Unfortunately for me, whenever you leave a floor and then come back later, the enemies will respawn. So as I try to run past everything, I make it back to the elevator, and finally I'm one step closer to a single upgrade of a single piece of gear. It's clear from the randomness of drops that the game does not seem to value your time. If there was a job out there where you had a 50-50 chance to get double your wage every paycheck or get nothing at all, no one will work at that place. Grinding in this game is mind-numbing and incredibly frustrating when luck isn't in your favor. However, there's actually one more method that can guarantee rare materials with no RNG. On certain days of the week, on floor 27, there is a traveling merchant that sells high-end materials for gold. The Tower of Barbs follows certain rotations for each day of the week, and some floors and routes only appear on certain days, which I thought was pretty cool. At the merchant, you can buy one of each item at a time, and you must wait 1 hour before the shop refreshes. This method allowed me to obtain materials that would only drop on floors 30 and up. The only drawback is that it's really expensive. An easy way to farm gold, as suggested by the community, is to just partake in the PvP content known as the Tokyo Death Metro, where you raid the base of another player for their resources. You generally want to target players that no longer play the game so they don't feel frustrated. But even with this method, you still need a high enough rank in the TDM to accumulate gold quickly. And given that there's only one possible level layout, each raid feels exactly the same, and it gets samey real quick. But hey, at least there's no RNG involved. So after all that, I was able to upgrade my iron to the extreme and take on the floor 30 boss, Mr. Crowley. He proved to be pretty easy to beat. Since I was already pretty overleveled at this point, there's nothing much to really talk about here. Finally, we're out of the carnival area and move onwards to an area that seems to be the rooftops of a city. Again, I like the aesthetics here. However, floor 31 is where things go from bad to worse, and if you thought the grind I just described wasn't brutal enough, it only picks up from here. By this point, I've seen a good chunk of the game to know how every mechanic works and what I needed to do to reach my goal. So while I farm materials, let me talk about a certain topic I see that crops up every now and then regarding this game. I've seen people comparing this game to Dark Souls, and I think that couldn't be further from the truth. To really examine this idea, we need to take a look at Let It Die's progression system. In gaming, primarily multiplayer and MMOs, there is the idea of a horizontal progression system and a vertical progression system. Vertical progression comes whenever new gear or strategies are just strictly and objectively better than what you have right now, so you always have to chase after better gear to progress with the game. A classic example of this is World of Warcraft, where the game introduces new equipment that's just strictly better than the previous, so all players will always have a goal to work towards. Horizontal progression is where the new gear you earn are not necessarily better, but just open up more options for you to use. Maybe some gear is better in some scenarios than others, and you'll have to use your knowledge of the game to know when to use what. In a game like Elden Ring, you'll pick up new weapons all the time, but equipment that drop from the end game aren't necessarily stronger than the ones from early game. They just provide more options for you to play with. In other words, vertical progression is more stat-based, while horizontal is more skill-based. And before anyone asks, there are advantages and disadvantages from both approaches. In most roguelikes, you'll often encounter a mixture of both types of progression systems. Games like Dead Cells or Hades do have stat upgrades like health potions and more revives, but your skill and knowledge of the game is also essential to winning. The closest to a purely skill-based game would have to be rhythm games. There's no upgrades or perks that can get you an advantage. Every level is the exact same every time you play it, so no outcome can be determined by luck. If you improve at a rhythm game, you really did just get better as a player. This is as skill-based as it gets. In Let It Die, however, your gear and weapons are the main reasons you succeed. It has a stat-based progression system. You can't upgrade your defense in Dark Souls since armor only have cosmetic purposes, and your ability to read enemy attacks and dodge at the correct timings is what defines your skill as a player. Let It Die, on the other hand, does not have a functional dodge roll, and there's no flow in combat. See, the gameplay feels very janky, but you can play around it by having overpowered gear. By having a high enough defense stat, you can tank multiple unfair hits. You can afford to make more mistakes. The point I'm trying to get across is that Let It Die is not a skill-based game. Calling this game a Soulslike is a disgrace to the Souls-like genre. I have no problems with people enjoying it for what it is. I just want to dispel the false belief that this game is somehow comparable to Dark Souls. It's not. Now, given that the difficulty picks up from here, let's talk about what you should do whenever you get gated by a boss. If you can't defeat a certain boss, any future floors are locked, so you have to defeat them in order to proceed with the game. Some floors have gear checks so extreme they are a completely different ballpark from the normal enemies you just fought. In some cases, if you're not properly geared, the boss can feel like a slug to go through given their inflated health and attack values, not to mention considering the game's clunky combat and the dire consequences of dying. So how should you approach them? Well, first of all, the game softly nudges you that you should probably farm up the best possible gear that you can find, as doing so will give you a much better fighting chance. Next, something the community would recommend is to farm up some mushrooms. Some of the consumable fungi you can scavenge have really powerful effects, like a mushroom that automatically revives you to 50% HP if you take fatal damage, or one that turns you invisible for 15 seconds, or one that stops time, or a late game one that literally turns you invulnerable to all sources of damage. Something you can do is to abuse the hell out of these effects. The one that stops time essentially stops all bosses in their tracks, while you dish out whatever damage you can within its effect. Search up any boss fight for these floors, and you just see people doing this exact strategy. This is obviously a very cheap and brain-dead way to get past the bosses. Some people would defend this by saying how the game already cheats you with its unfair mechanics, so you should cheat back using this underhanded method. But my argument is that boss fights in video games are supposed to pose some degree of challenge, where you learn their attacks and weak points and eventually overcome them when you get better at the game. Where is the challenge if you literally just make yourself invincible and be unable to take any damage at all while you take pot shots at the boss with no strategy or consequences? For me, this is not fulfilling or fun, yet I'm forced to do this to make safe and steady progress, and I'm not the only one that's felt this frustration. To really illustrate how important it is to keep your equipment to the best quality you can, here's my experience fighting a new mini-boss on floor 32.
What in the goddamn?
So I enter the arena, and as you can see, yeah, a single hit wiped out 100% of my health. Now I did manage to down this mini-boss, but even then, I researched beforehand how to deal with this and still had a rough time with it. Now, you could just retort by saying, get good. Don't rely on cheap strategies. Don't use overpowered gear. Fight the bosses fair and square, and if you die, just try again. On paper, this idea is fine, and I would have definitely preferred to do it this way. Except in this game, you really don't want to die. Dying will set you back somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour trying to buy back your fighter by grinding coins or equip yourself in a fresh set of gear. It will set you back that much time just so you can have another attempt at the boss. The safest and optimal strategy is to get past the levels using whatever gear or weapons that give you the best chance of survival, and get through them by any means necessary. And most importantly, avoid dying at all costs. This game does not reward you for experimenting with different strategies that you might think of, which directly contradicts what a roguelike should be. My experience with floors 31 to 40 was probably the roughest out of all the previous floors. Dying on these levels will net you a huge gold loss to recover your fighter. Without the literal best of the best gear at this point will get you annihilated in just a couple of hits. The only problem is that you have to farm the materials that spawn at these floors, so even a farming run may not be as simple as you think. This is also the stage of the game where your item upgrades cost ludicrous amounts of resources. You can farm them for an entire day and be enough to upgrade one item to a comfortable amount. After a lot of planning and finessing, I finally managed to pull through to floor 40, aka the final boss fight of the main game. The final boss is Taro Gunkanyama. He's a sumo wrestler. We start the fight by having our gear completely stripped away. Then fight some haters on a platform. Getting knocked off means instant death. Once you reclaim your weapons, the main event starts. And let me tell you, this was actually the best fight I've seen in the game. First of all, the soundtrack goes hard. I was actually tearing up because of how hyped the track was. Here, take a listen. In this fight, Taro jumps, dashes, swings, and rolls around you, while there are actual attack windows that you can punish, and ways to actually dodge them. Yes, the jank is still there. You can still get unfairly chained into an instant death. Yes, it's still a gear check, as having the best gear makes this fight a lot easier, but I think this fight is a prime example of what the game could have been. The OST sounds like something straight out of a Yakuza game, and the fight itself is dripping with interesting flavor. This has got to be, dare I say, one of the most creative, engaging video game boss fights I've seen in a while. Now, I won't spoil the ending, obviously, and it's not like the story was that good anyways. But yeah, after you beat Taro, that's it. That's Let It Die. To transition into the next topic, as I was already praising this boss fight, I wanted to highlight some of my favorite moments during my time with this game. Despite all its rough edges, I don't think it's fair to say that the game is all bad. There are clearly some unique aspects and feel-good moments I haven't felt in a while. For example, I fondly remember my sigh of relief when I saw the golden glow of an elevator as I was just about to run out of resources on the higher floors. The odd and eccentric style the game takes, especially with the lore in boss fights, and how a pamphlet has comics for the boss's origins. It's also got a highly addictive soundtrack, as the composer licensed hundreds of songs from artists and asked them all to name their songs Let It Die. This is genuinely really cool. The creativity is something I don't see very often in gaming. It's a shame that radio doesn't play more often during gameplay. My favorite track from the OST has got to be Let It Die. This game, in my opinion, does have a pay-to-win model, but it's not that bad. The main concern is the grind, which is not something that can be easily skipped. Looking at the reception surrounding this game, the reviews across the board have always just been okay. It's sitting at a 7 out of 10 on Metacritic, and mostly positive on Steam. It's clear that a small, dedicated fanbase still enjoys this game, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let It Die is a deeply flawed game with silver linings. At certain points, I wanted to give up. I didn't see the point of committing so much of my time and energy into a game that doesn't seem to value them. Why would I spend 30 minutes in an hour grinding for materials that might not even spawn when I can just hop on a game with the boys in Deep Rock Galactic? To people that defend this game, 88% of players who have the game in their library never made it past the first major boss fight. Why do you think this is the case? Even Warframe has an achievement where you play for 2 hours, and 40% of players have that achievement. Let It Die has many problems, but at the end of the day, I honestly think this game was onto something. The boss fights all have their distinctive style. The idea of an ever-changing tower can spell an exciting new journey for players every run. Let it be known that I am not against the idea of a live service roguelike. Imagine a roguelike with a monetization model like Deep Rock Galactic. One-time fee, no microtransactions. You try to make it to the exit of a sprawling labyrinth that changes every day, with different biomes and themes, with different bosses and unlockable upgrades and cosmetics. You can chat with other players in a hub area, where you'll share your cool-looking skins and encourage one another to go on another run. Each season will have different events that can occur randomly during runs, like a bonus level or boss that is optional, and a free battle pass, just like Deep Rock Galactic, that unlocks limited cosmetic items, and maybe some paid DLCs for skins and new areas here and there. A skill-based roguelike with no pay-to-win mechanics, no leaderboards, no PvP. Not a money-hungry freemium model of monetization, but just a game that values your time and wants you to have some fun. The game I just described honestly sounds like a game I would play for ages, and one that will probably never exist. Just like Deep Rock Galactic. Honestly, you should play this game right now. To close off this video, I want to share something interesting I heard at a conference by a mobile game studio CEO on how to find whales for your game. Here's what he had to say.
Make sure that your games aren't too skill-based. I made that mistake myself. A too skill-based game, you don't get people to pay you because there's no reason to.
That's right. Skill-based games make less money. It really puts into perspective where the gaming industry is taking us. This last section will be my thoughts about the direction of the idea of games as a service, or GAAS. It's the idea that just like many online softwares, paying for them will require a subscription instead of a one-time fee. Whether you like it or not, this is the direction gaming will go in the future. The top games played right now are all live services. I've seen many examples of these companies screw over consumers with questionable decisions, but at the end of the day, no matter how much criticism you throw at them, it ultimately boils down to one decision you can make. Do you play the game or do you not play the game? And if your answer is play, then they can do whatever they want. Overwatch 2, getting all the flack from its problems with the Battle Pass, yet it exceeds the success of the first game, amassing over a daily player count of over 900,000 players. Pokemon Violet and Scarlet, despite having glaring issues with its performance and quality, sold over 10 million copies, becoming the best-selling Nintendo game of all time. Diablo Immortal, heavily scrutinized for its monetization, has grossed over $90 million and is within the top 10 highest grossing mobile games right now. It is absolutely okay to critique something you like, but just know that for big companies like these, data is everything. If I was Game Freak developing Pokemon, and I put minimum effort into developing my game, shipped it while having blatant performance issues and glitches, yet my consumers are eating that up, defending me, and buying my games like hotcakes, why would I put any more effort into my games? We can complain about freemium games all we want, but at the end of the day, no matter how much complaint these companies get, it works, and it'll keep working. The one message I have is to speak out against the things you don't like with actions, not words. One last thing. The publisher for Let It Die actually released an indirect sequel to the game. It's a battle royale that released this October named Deathverse Let It Die. I wonder how it's doing.
Well, it's a little embarrassing.